Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following presentation is for educational and entertainment purposes only. The information shared regarding legal trends, sociological data, and historical metrics does not constitute professional legal, financial, or psychological advice. This content is intended to provide a macro-level analysis of historical trends and potential outcomes based on available data as of 2026. Viewers are encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified professionals regarding any personal legal or marital matters. Imagine a town where the smoke from the stacks once signified a lifetime of security. In places like Connorsville, Indiana, or Madison, the local manufacturing plant wasn't just a place of employment. It was the foundation of the American family. In 1960, if you got a job at the local mill, you didn't just get a paycheck, you got a house, a pension, and a marriage that was statistically built to last until the funeral. But today, if you walk through these same streets, the metrics tell a different, much more somber story. In some of these post-industrial hubs, the divorce rate has climbed to over 22%, nearly double the national average. We are witnessing a silent autopsy of the American dream being performed in the fluorescent-lit halls of county clerk offices across the Rust Belt. While the coastlines talk about tech booms and AI revolutions, the heartland is grappling with the rusting of the marital contract. This isn't just a series about heartbreaks. It is a deep-dive masterclass into the data-driven reality of how economic decay translates into domestic dissolution. We are going to explore why the decline of the assembly line led directly to the rise of the divorce filing, and what these historical trends can tell us about the future of the American family unit. By the end of this deep dive, you will understand the specific sociological levers that make the Rust Belt a unique laboratory for marital metrics. We will move past the superficial 50% of marriages end in divorce myth and look at the refined metrics that matter. The marriage-to-divorce ratio, the impact of educational attainment on union stability, and the stress diathesis model that explains why some communities thrive while others fracture. This is your guide to understanding the intersection of geography, economy, and intimacy in a post-industrial world. To truly understand why the Rust Belt is currently experiencing these specific marital metrics, we have to go back to the blueprint. In the mid-20th century, the American Midwest was the engine of the global economy. This era created what sociologists call the Standard North American Family, or SNAF. This model was predicated on a specific economic reality: a single male breadwinner wage that was high enough to support a household, a mortgage, and a stable domestic environment. In the 1950s and 60s, the divorce rate in these industrial centers was actually remarkably low compared to the national trend. The factory was the glue. It provided a predictable life cycle. Graduate high school, enter the plant, get married, and stay married. However, as we move into the late 1970s and 1980s, the metrics began to pivot. Deindustrialization didn't just remove jobs. It removed the invisible script that held these marriages together. When the primary employer in a town like Youngstown, Ohio, or Flint, Michigan, closes its doors, the impact isn't just felt in the local tax base. It triggers a cascade of psychological and sociological stressors. In our first case study, we look at the procyclical nature of divorce. Historically, we see that divorce rates actually tend to dip slightly during immediate economic recessions because the act of legal dissolution is expensive. People often can't afford to leave when they are at their poorest. But in the Rust Belt, we see a lagging metric effect. The stress of long-term economic stagnation, the kind that lasts decades rather than months, acts as a slow-motion corrosive agent on marital stability. When we look at the refined divorce rate, which is the number of divorces per 1,000 married women, the national average in 2024 and 2025 has hovered around 14.2. But when you zoom into specific counties in the Rust Belt, that number often spikes. Why? It comes down to the loss of marital capital. Marital capital consists of the shared assets, social networks, and community ties that make staying together more beneficial than leaving. In a thriving economy, couples build this capital quickly. In a rusting economy, that capital is depleted by debt, underemployment, and the loss of community status. Consider the male breadwinner identity crisis. In many Rust Belt communities, the culture is still deeply rooted in traditional gender roles. When the industrial sector contracted, it was the high-paying, traditionally male jobs that disappeared first. Research indicates that when a husband's economic contribution is suddenly and permanently diminished, in a culture that prizes that role, the risk of marital dissolution increases significantly. This isn't just an anecdote, it's a measurable historical trend. we see a direct correlation between the rise of service sector jobs, which often pay less and offer fewer benefits, and the increase in gray divorce among older couples who realize their retirement dreams have evaporated along with their pensions. We must also distinguish between crude and refined metrics. The crude divorce rate, the number of divorces per 1,000 total people, is what you often see in clickbait headlines. It's a blunt instrument that doesn't account for who is actually married or the age of the population. In this deep dive, we use the refined divorce rate because it gives us the at-risk population. In 2026, we are seeing a fascinating divergence. Younger couples in the Rust Belt are actually getting married later, which traditionally leads to higher stability. However, the backlog of marriages from the transition era, those formed just as the mills were closing, are the ones currently driving the high metrics in states like Indiana and Kentucky. Another layer to this data is the divorce contagion effect in small interconnected towns. In a dense urban environment, a divorce might go unnoticed by your social circle. In a tight-knit Rust Belt community where everyone knows everyone's business, a divorce can lower the barrier to entry for others. When one couple in a social network of 4 or 5 couples divorces, the statistical likelihood of the others following suit increases. It normalizes the process as a viable solution to the shared economic stress they are all feeling. This brings us to the stress diathesis model. In sociology, this model suggests that a marriage has a certain level of diathesis or vulnerability, based on personality, upbringing, and values, and is then subjected to stress, economic loss, health issues, community decay. The Rust Belt serves as a high-stress environment that tests the vulnerabilities of every union. While a couple in a booming tech hub might have the financial buffer to hire a therapist or take a vacation to reconcile, a couple in a struggling manufacturing town may find that the cost of a broken water heater is the final straw that breaks the camel's back. In the next sections of this deep dive, we will break down the specific legal frameworks of states like Pennsylvania and Ohio to see how no-fault laws interacted with the economic collapse of the 80s to create the landscape we see today. We will look at the marriage-to-divorce ratio, a metric that shows for every 2.4 marriages in the US, there is one divorce, and why that ratio looks so different in a town that has lost 40% of its population since 1970. We are moving beyond the surface to understand the mechanical reality of the American heartland. This is the autopsy of the industrial marriage, and the data is just beginning to speak. To understand why the Rust Belt serves as the epicenter of this data, we have to examine the collapse of what economists call the family wage. Imagine if you were living in a city like Erie, Pennsylvania, or Youngstown, Ohio in the mid-20th century. At that time, a single income from a steel mill or a tool and die shop wasn't just a paycheck. It was a stabilizer for the entire domestic structure. This economic model allowed for a clear division of labor within the household, which, according to historical trends, provided a predictable, if rigid, framework for marital longevity. But as we sit here in 2026, looking back at the trajectory of these cities, that framework has been completely dismantled. Let us look at a specific case study involving a fictional but representative couple, David and Sarah, living in Dayton, Ohio. David is 44 years old, and in 2026, he works as a logistics coordinator for a regional shipping firm. His grandfather worked at the local NCR plant for 40 years, retired with a full pension, and stayed married to his grandmother for 52 years. For the grandfather, the marriage was supported by an external architecture of economic certainty. For David, that architecture is gone. When we analyze the refined divorce rate in Montgomery County, Ohio, we see a distinct pattern of stress that David and Sarah navigate every day. The modern service economy in the Rust Belt is characterized by what researchers call job churn. David's position is at the mercy of global supply chain shifts, and Sarah works as a freelance healthcare administrator. The data suggests that when both partners are forced into a state of perpetual economic adaptation, the marital unit loses its role as a sanctuary and instead becomes another site of negotiation and stress management. In the Rust Belt, this is exacerbated by the loss of marital capital. Marital capital is the sum of the assets, community ties, and shared investments a couple builds over time. In a thriving economy, your home is an appreciating asset that acts as a financial anchor. In many parts of the Rust Belt, stagnant or depreciating home values mean that a house is often a liability rather than an asset. When David and Sarah's home value fails to keep pace with inflation, they aren't just losing money. They are losing the physical and financial glue that makes staying together an economically rational choice. We must also dive into the education gap. which is one of the most significant predictors of divorce metrics in the current year. In 2026, the divergence in marriage stability between those with a 4-year degree and those without has reached a historic high. In states like Michigan and Indiana, the divorce rate for couples where neither partner has a college degree is nearly 3 times higher than for couples with at least 1 degree. This isn't because of a lack of commitment, it is because of the resource theory of marriage. This theory posits that couples with higher educational attainment generally have access to better conflict resolution skills, more stable social networks, and most importantly, a financial buffer that prevents everyday stressors from escalating into catastrophic marital arguments. Consider the step-by-step breakdown of a typical economic stress event in a post-industrial town. A sudden $400 car repair in a household with no savings doesn't just impact the bank account. It triggers a cascade of psychological responses. In a high-resource household, this is an inconvenience. In a low-resource household in the Rust Belt, it leads to a debate over which bill goes unpaid. This debate leads to a rise in cortisol levels, which in turn leads to a breakdown in communication. Historical trends show that in regions with high concentrations of service sector employment, these small, repetitive stressors act as a corrosive agent on the marriage over a period of 3 to 5 years, eventually leading to a filing for dissolution. Another critical metric we need to analyze is the brain drain effect and how it skews the divorce data. For decades, the most mobile and often the most highly educated residents of the Rust Belt have migrated to the Sun Belt or the coastal tech hubs. This leaves behind a population with a higher concentration of the very risk factors that contribute to marital instability: lower median incomes, higher rates of disability, and less access to preventative mental health care. When we look at the 2026 divorce metrics for a city like Flint, Michigan, we are looking at a population that has been subjected to a generational culling of resources. The couples who stay are often those with the fewest options, meaning their marriages are subjected to the highest levels of environmental pressure. We also have to discuss the sociological phenomenon known as the diverging destinies of the American family. In 2026, the Rust Belt serves as the primary example of this divergence. On one hand, you have the professional class in rejuvenated hubs like Pittsburgh, where marriage rates are stabilizing and divorce rates are actually falling. On the other hand, you have the surrounding rural and semi-industrial counties where the metrics are trending in the opposite direction. This creates a geography of instability. In Pennsylvania, the difference in the marriage-to-divorce ratio between Allegheny County and its more rural neighbors is a testament to how localized economic health dictates the longevity of a union. Furthermore, we must address the despair metrics. There is a documented, measurable correlation between the rise of deaths of despair, including those related to substance abuse, and the breakdown of the marital unit in the Midwest. In 2026, we are seeing the long-term effects of the opioid crisis on the divorce courts. When one partner is dealing with addiction or the psychological fallout of chronic underemployment, the burden on the other partner often becomes unsustainable. The legal metrics show a significant rise in divorces cited under the umbrella of irreconcilable differences that, upon closer inspection, are driven by these underlying sociological pathologies. But there is a hidden mechanism at play that most people miss when looking at these charts. It is a phenomenon that actually keeps people together for the wrong reasons, creating a state of marital stasis that is just as revealing as the divorce rate itself. It involves the very ground these couples walk on and the walls they live within. In the next part, we are going to look at the housing trap. We will explore how the unique real estate market of the Rust Belt in 2026 is forcing thousands of separated couples to continue living together in a state of legal and emotional limbo, because they simply cannot afford to sell their homes or move into separate apartments. Why is the cost of leaving becoming more prohibitive than the cost of staying? And what does this mean for the next generation of American families? The answer lies in the specific debt-to-income ratios that are currently defining the heartland. The debt-to-income ratio is the silent executioner of many divorce petitions in the American Midwest in 2026. While the national discourse often focuses on the emotional or psychological catalyst for a breakup, the raw financial data tells a story of structural imprisonment. To understand this, we have to look at the 2026 thresholds for mortgage qualification and how they have diverged from the reality of the Rust Belt economy. In cities like Cleveland, Ohio, or Buffalo, New York, the average household debt-to-income ratio has climbed significantly over the last 5 years, largely due to a combination of stagnating wages in the service sector and the rising costs of essential services. When a couple decides to dissolve their marriage, the first step is usually the division of the primary asset, the home. However, in the Rust Belt, this asset is frequently more of a chain than a buoy. Imagine a couple named James and Maria living in a suburb of Cleveland. They have been married for 12 years. James works in industrial maintenance, and Maria is a specialized technician in a local medical lab. Collectively, their income is respectable for the region, but their debt-to-income ratio is locked at 42%. This figure is critical because 43% is the traditional ceiling for many conventional mortgage products. In the current 2026 lending environment, if James and Maria were to divorce, they would need to sell their home and each find new separate housing. But here is where the math of the heartland becomes a trap. Their home, purchased in 2014, has seen modest appreciation compared to the meteoric rises in Florida or Texas. After factoring in the 6% real estate commission, the costs of closing, and the current 2026 interest rates for a new individual mortgage, neither James nor Maria can afford to buy the other out, nor can they afford to qualify for two separate, smaller homes in a safe neighborhood near their jobs. This creates the phenomenon of the housing trap. Historical trends in the Rust Belt show that when home equity is low or negative, a situation often referred to as being underwater, the divorce rate in that specific zip code tends to artificially depress. This is not because the marriages are happier. It is because the cost of exit is higher than the participants can bear. We call this the latent divorce metric. It represents the thousands of couples who have emotionally and socially separated, but remain legally and residentially bound. In 2026, the data shows a significant spike in what sociologists call birdnesting or in-house separation. This is a step-by-step process where a couple legally files for separation, but continues to cohabitate in the same dwelling, because the regional economy offers no affordable alternatives. Step 1 of the housing trap usually begins with the realization that the primary residence cannot be refinanced. In 2026, lenders have tightened their requirements for a cash-out refinance, which is the traditional way one spouse buys out the other's equity. In a city like Detroit or Youngstown, where property values may have plateaued or only risen at the rate of inflation, there is often not enough equity to facilitate a buyout. Step 2 involves the realization that the rental market in the Rust Belt has become decoupled from local wages. While home prices in these regions remain lower than the national average, the rental rates have surged due to corporate acquisitions of single-family homes. For James and Maria, moving into two separate two-bedroom apartments would cost them 40% more per month than their current combined mortgage payment. Step 3 is the legal stalemate. In states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, the law often requires a definitive separation of assets before a divorce decree is finalized. If the assets cannot be separated because the house cannot be sold or refinanced, the case remains in a state of perpetual limbo. This leads to a measurable increase in the duration of divorce proceedings in the Rust Belt. In 2026, the average time from filing to finalization in high stagnation counties is now 18 months, compared to a national average of 12. This 6-year delta is almost entirely driven by the difficulty of liquidating or dividing the family home in a depressed market. The consequences of this are profound for the regional labor market. Because these couples are trapped in their homes, they are also trapped in their local job markets. They cannot move to follow better opportunities because their financial lives are tethered to a shared mortgage they cannot escape. This contributes to the overall economic sluggishness of the Rust Belt, creating a feedback loop where marital instability leads to economic immobility, which in turn leads to further marital instability. Historical trends suggest that this creates a lost generation of equity. Instead of building wealth through homeownership, these couples are essentially paying a maintenance fee on a failed relationship. Furthermore, we must examine the impact of the 2026 child support and alimony calculators used in these states. These formulas were largely designed during periods of higher economic growth and do not always account for the unique cost of living challenges in a post-industrial landscape. For a worker in a declining manufacturing town, a standard child support order can consume up to 30% of their take-home pay. When you combine this with the high cost of maintaining a separate household, the potential outcome for many men in the Rust Belt is a descent into what is known as the working poor. The data indicates that men who divorce in these regions are 60% more likely to experience a significant drop in their standard of living compared to their counterparts in the coastal states, where higher wages and more robust job markets allow for a quicker financial recovery. For the women, the risks are equally high but different in nature. In the Rust Belt, women are more likely to be employed in the healthcare or education sectors, jobs that are stable but often have lower wage ceilings than the disappearing manufacturing roles. Following a divorce, a woman in a town like Scranton, Pennsylvania, often finds herself in a position where she has the house but cannot afford the taxes, utilities, and maintenance on a single income. This leads to the phenomenon of the house poor divorcee, where the primary asset becomes a liability that drains her ability to save for retirement or invest in her children's future. Imagine the psychological toll of this stasis. In 2026, we see a rise in domestic mediation services that specialize in shared occupancy divorces. These are professionals who help couples navigate the rules of living together while being legally separated. Who uses the kitchen at what time, how the utility bills are split, and how to maintain a semblance of a normal life for the children while the parents occupy separate bedrooms. This is the new reality of the American heartland. It is a marriage of necessity, a union forged not by love but by the harsh mathematics of the debt-to-income ratio. But there is an even more complex layer to this story that involves the next generation. We are starting to see the data on the children who are growing up in these high-tension, low-equity households. It is not just about the parents' bank accounts. It is about the emotional inheritance of the Rust Belt. As we move into the next part of this deep dive, we have to ask, what happens to the children who spend their formative years watching a zombie marriage play out in real time? How does the economic stagnation of a town affect the intergenerational transfer of marital stability? The answer lies in the specific education and employment pathways available to these youth in 2026. Are we witnessing the birth of a permanent class of the matrimonially immobile? In the next section, we will look at the alarming rise of the kinship care metric and how the grandparents of the Rust Belt are becoming the new front line of the American family. The kinship care metric is perhaps the most poignant indicator of the structural fracturing occurring within the American heartland in 2026. To understand the depth of this shift, we must look at the data surrounding what sociologists call skip-generation households. In traditional metrics, a divorce involves two parties and perhaps their children. In the Rust Belt, the footprint of a marital dissolution often expands to include a third generation by necessity. Kinship care refers to the full-time care, nurturing, and protection of children by relatives, members of their tribes or clans, godparents, step-parents, or any adult who has a kinship bond with a child. In 2026, the density of these households in states like West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky has reached levels that resemble post-war Reconstruction zones rather than stable industrial states. Imagine a woman named Brenda living in Huntington, West Virginia. In 2026, Brenda is 62 years old. She had planned to retire from her job at a regional medical processing center, a plan built on the modest equity of her home and a small 401k. However, the divorce of her son, coupled with his subsequent struggle with long-term underemployment and the regional opioid shadow, has forced a total redirection of her life. Brenda is now the primary caregiver for her two grandsons, ages 7 and 9. This is not an isolated anecdote. It is a statistical pillar of the modern Rust Belt. Historically, kinship care was a temporary safety net. In 2026, it has become a permanent demographic fixture. Let us look at the step-by-step financial breakdown of this transition. Step 1 is the legal redirection of resources. When a marriage in this region dissolves and the parents are deemed unable to provide a stable environment, often due to a combination of economic instability and the psychological toll of the regional crisis, the grandparents are frequently the first line of defense. However, in 2026, the legal system in many Midwest states has a significant lag in providing financial support for kinship caregivers compared to traditional foster parents. While a foster parent might receive a monthly stipend of $800 to $1,200 per child, a grandmother like Brenda might receive only a fraction of that through temporary assistance for needy families or TANF. This creates what economists call the grandparent trap. In 2026, the cost of raising a child in the U.S. has continued to outpace inflation, especially in the realms of healthcare and education. Brenda is spending her retirement savings on school clothes, sports fees, and pediatric dental care. The historical trend shows that this leads to a secondary economic collapse, the depletion of the elderly's wealth. This wealth was supposed to be the cushion that kept Brenda from becoming a ward of the state in her 80s. Instead, it is being liquidated to mitigate the fallout of a failed industrial-era marriage. This is the definition of intergenerational poverty being codified by marital metrics. The data for 2026 indicates that in certain counties in the Rust Belt, 1 in 10 children is being raised primarily by a grandparent. To put that in perspective, that is nearly double the national average. When we map these kinship care hotspots, They align almost perfectly with the regions that saw the greatest loss of manufacturing jobs between 1990 and 2010. This is the long tail of deindustrialization. The divorce isn't just an end to a relationship. It is the final trigger that moves a child from a nuclear family into a multi-generational survival unit. Furthermore, we must examine the educational outcomes associated with this metric. Step by step, the data shows that children in kinship care face unique hurdles. In 2026, the digital divide in the Rust Belt remains a significant barrier. While Brenda may have a stable home, she often lacks the technical literacy to help her grandsons navigate the increasingly AI-integrated curriculum of the local school district. The historical trend suggests that children in these households are more likely to experience educational disruptions, not because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of resources. The kinship care metric is a leading indicator of future workforce readiness. If a significant portion of the next generation in the Rust Belt is being raised in households where the primary caregivers are on fixed incomes and managing the stresses of their own aging, the long-term potential outcomes for the regional economy are increasingly constrained. Imagine the psychological impact on the caregivers. In 2026, we are seeing a rise in what is called caregiver burnout among the elderly in the Midwest. This isn't just physical exhaustion. It is the psychological weight of the double loss. Brenda has lost the relationship she had with her son, who is now a secondary figure in his children's lives, and she has lost the future she imagined for herself. This stress manifests in the health metrics of the region. There is a measurable correlation between high kinship care rates and increased rates of hypertension and stress-related illnesses among women over 60 in these zip codes. We also have to look at the legal hurdles of 2026. Obtaining legal guardianship, not just physical custody, is an arduous and expensive process. In states like Ohio, the step-by-step legal requirements to prove that a parent is unfit can take years of litigation. During this time, the grandparents are often in a legal gray zone. They may not be able to sign for medical procedures or access the children's educational records without the consent of the very parents whose instability necessitated the kinship care in the first place. This creates a state of perpetual administrative anxiety. This brings us to a critical realization. The divorce metrics in the Rust Belt are not just about the dissolution of the present. They are about the destabilization of the past and the future simultaneously. When Brenda spends her pension on her grandsons, she is essentially subsidizing the failure of the regional economy and the social safety net. This is a massive, invisible transfer of wealth from the elderly to the young, driven entirely by the collapse of the industrial marital model. Historical trends suggest that without significant policy intervention, this will lead to a permanent class of the under-resourced, where the primary inheritance is not property or capital, but the shared debt of survival. But what happens when even the grandparents can't hold it together? What happens when the legal system itself becomes so overwhelmed by these cases that it begins to look for alternatives that were once unthinkable? In the next part of this deep dive, we are going to look at the rise of the shadow divorce market. We will explore how a new wave of DIY legal technologies and unregulated mediation services are filling the vacuum left by a traditional legal system that has become too expensive for the very people who need it most. We will investigate the 2026 trend of private arbitrated dissolution and why the courtrooms of the Rust Belt are being replaced by high-stakes negotiations in community centers and church basements. Is the American legal system losing its grip on the heartland's most intimate contracts? The answer lies in the specific rise of the pro-se litigant and the automation of heartbreak. The rise of the pro-se litigant is the defining characteristic of the Rust Belt's family courts in 2026. Pro-se, a Latin term meaning for oneself, refers to individuals who navigate the complexities of the legal system without the representation of an attorney. In a region where the median household income has failed to keep pace with the skyrocketing costs of legal services, which now often exceed $350 per hour for even a junior associate, representing oneself is rarely a choice. It is a financial necessity. Historical trends indicate that as recently as 15 years ago, roughly 60% of domestic cases involved at least one self-represented party. By 2026, in specific jurisdictions like Lake County, Indiana, or Mahoning County, Ohio, that number has surged to over 85%. This is the democratization of legal proceedings, but it comes with a high price tag of systemic inefficiency and uneven potential outcomes. Imagine a man named Mark living in Gary, Indiana. In 2026, Mark is 47 years old and works as a specialized mechanic for an automated warehouse facility. After 20 years of marriage, he and his spouse have decided to separate. Mark looks at his bank account and realizes that a traditional retainer for a reputable family law firm, often starting at $5,000, represents nearly 3 months of his mortgage and utility payments. For Mark, hiring a lawyer would mean liquidating his modest emergency fund and potentially defaulting on other obligations. So Mark enters the shadow market of DIY legal technology. Step 1 for Mark is the engagement with automated legal platforms. In 2026, these platforms use sophisticated algorithms to generate divorce petitions based on user input. Mark sits at his kitchen table late at night and begins the step-by-step process of data entry. He uploads his pay stubs, his tax returns, and the deed to his home. The software, designed for national efficiency, often misses the nuanced local rules of the Indiana court system. This is the first fracture in the shadow market. The historical trend in these cases shows that while the software can produce a document that looks professional, it cannot provide the strategic counsel required to navigate the division of complex assets like Mark's legacy pension or his spouse's specialized healthcare benefits. The next step in Mark's journey is the filing process. In 2026, many Rust Belt counties have moved to mandatory e-filing systems. For a professional attorney, this is a routine task. For Mark, it is a digital labyrinth. He must navigate outdated county portals that were never designed for high-volume use by non-professionals. When his filing is rejected due to a minor technical error, perhaps a missing local rule disclosure or an incorrectly formatted exhibit, Mark has no one to call. He is trapped in a cycle of administrative corrections that can delay his case for months. This delay is a measurable metric. In 2026, Pro-SE cases in the Midwest take an average of 22% longer to reach a final decree than those with attorney representation. This is the friction of the heartland's legal machinery. This brings us to the rise of what we call generic justice. Because the courts are overwhelmed by thousands of marks, the judges and magistrates in these regions have been forced to adopt a policy of high-volume processing. In a 5-minute hearing, a magistrate must review a settlement agreement that Mark and his spouse drafted on a kitchen table. If the agreement is missing critical language regarding future healthcare costs, or the specific calculation of overnight visits for child support, the magistrate might sign it anyway just to clear the docket. This leads to the settlement gap. Data from 2026 suggests that self-represented litigants in the Rust Belt receive, on average, 15% less in asset distribution than they would have with an advocate. They simply do not know what they are entitled to under the law. Furthermore, we are seeing the emergence of the church basement arbitrator. In 2026, traditional mediation has become too expensive for many families, leading them to seek out unregulated, community-based dispute resolution. These are often retired teachers, local clergy, or community leaders who offer to help couples split their lives for a fraction of the cost of a legal professional. While these individuals provide a vital social service by reducing conflict, they operate in a legal vacuum. They are not bound by the same ethical or professional standards as licensed mediators. Historical trends show that agreements reached in these informal settings are 3 times more likely to be contested in court later, when one party realizes the agreement was legally lopsided. This is the shadow market's ultimate failure. It trades immediate peace for long-term legal instability. Consider the step-by-step breakdown of a private arbitrated dissolution. A couple meets with a community leader. They agree on who gets the car, who keeps the dog, and how to split the debt from their credit cards. They sign a handwritten agreement, believing they have solved their problems. However, in 2026, the legal requirements for transferring a car title or removing a name from a mortgage are more stringent than ever. When the couple goes to the bank or the DMV with their handwritten note, they are turned away. They find themselves in a state of legal limbo, married in the eyes of the state and the bank, but separated in their daily lives. This creates a massive backlog of what we call zombie cases in the court system, where couples must return years later to fix mistakes made in the shadow market. This phenomenon is also changing the landscape of the regional legal profession. In 2026, the middle-market family law firm in the Rust Belt is effectively extinct. There is a high-end boutique sector that serves the wealthy in cities like Indianapolis or Columbus, and there are mass-market legal mills that process thousands of low-fee cases using AI-driven systems. The local community lawyer who knew the family and the local judge has been priced out or automated out of existence. This leaves a vacuum of personal advocacy that is being filled by chatbots and community volunteers. But as Mark and thousands like him navigate this automated heartbreak, A new and even more complex metric is emerging. It involves the very nature of work in 2026. As the Rust Belt transitions from manufacturing to a fragmented gig economy, the old formulas for child support and alimony are becoming obsolete. How do you calculate support for a father who works 3 different apps and has no predictable weekly income? How does a mother plan a future when her ex-spouse's earnings fluctuate by 50% every month based on a global algorithm? In the next part, we will dive into the gig economy gap. We will explore how the volatility of 2026 employment is breaking the traditional child support calculator, and why the financial safety net for children in the Midwest is currently hanging by a thread. The math of the heartland is changing, and the kids are the ones paying the interest. To understand the gig economy gap, we have to look at the life of Marcus in Toledo, Ohio. In 2026, the local manufacturing base has largely transitioned to high-tech, automated fulfillment centers that rely heavily on a flexible, non-permanent workforce. Marcus, like nearly 30% of his neighbors in the Glass City, does not receive a traditional biweekly paycheck with a steady tax withholding statement. Instead, his income is a digital pulse, fluctuating based on the algorithmic demand for delivery and transportation services across the Great Lakes region. This volatility is the primary reason why the traditional child support formulas of the Rust Belt are currently failing. The core of the problem lies in the Ohio Child Support Guideline Manual, which, like many state guidelines in the Midwest, was originally drafted during an era of industrial stability. These formulas typically rely on a snapshot of historical earnings to project future obligations. However, in the 2026 gig economy, a snapshot is effectively useless. Imagine if Marcus has a highly profitable month in June because of a regional logistics surge, earning $5,000. Under the current legal framework, the court might set his child support obligation based on that high watermark. But by October, the algorithm shifts, demand drops, or Marcus's vehicle requires a $2,000 repair. Suddenly, his take-home pay plummeted to $1,200, yet his legal obligation remains pegged to his June earnings. This creates a step-by-step descent into what we call administrative arrears. Step 1 is the initial mismatch. When Marcus cannot meet the full payment in October, the system automatically marks him as delinquent. Unlike a traditional bank loan, child support arrears in states like Ohio and Michigan often carry mandatory interest rates that can reach as high as 10% annually. Step 2 is the modification hurdle. To change his payment amount, Marcus must file a formal motion for modification with the court. In 2026, the backlog for these hearings in high-volume counties like Lucas or Cuyahoga is often 4 to 6 months. During those 6 months, Marcus continues to accrue debt at the higher rate, even if his actual income has disappeared. Step 3 is the impact on his ability to work. In the Rust Belt, the primary enforcement mechanism for unpaid child support is the suspension of a driver's license. For a gig worker like Marcus, a driver's license is his only means of production. By suspending his license to force payment, the state effectively removes his ability to earn any income at all, ensuring that he falls further into a debt spiral. Historical trends show that once a non-custodial parent in the Midwest falls more than $5,000 behind in support, the likelihood of them ever catching up drops by over 70%. This is the math of the heartland, a system designed for the assembly line trying to regulate a world run by apps. Now, consider the other side of this equation, the custodial parent, whom we will call Elena. Elena is a medical assistant in a Toledo clinic. She relies on that child support to bridge the gap between her modest salary and the rising cost of 2026 essentials, like childcare and utilities. In the Midwest, the cost of center-based childcare has increased by 15% over the last 2 years alone. When Marcus's payments become inconsistent due to his gig volatility, Elena's household enters a state of perpetual financial high alert. She cannot plan for a summer camp, a new pair of shoes, or an emergency savings fund because her secondary income source is as unpredictable as the weather. The potential outcomes for children in these households are measurable and concerning. In 2026, we see a distinct correlation between gig income volatility and housing instability for divorced families in the Rust Belt. When the support check doesn't arrive, the rent or mortgage payment is often the first thing to be compromised. We see a rise in what sociologists call the two-address shuffle, where children are moved between relatives or lower quality housing because the financial foundation of the primary household is constantly shifting. This isn't just about poverty, it's about the psychological toll of uncertainty. Children in these environments are 40% more likely to experience chronic stress-related health issues compared to those in households with a fixed, predictable support structure. We must also look at the resource theory of parenting in this context. In 2026, success in the American heartland is increasingly tied to extracurricular enrichment, specialized tutoring, sports teams, and digital literacy programs. In the old industrial model, these were funded by the surplus of a stable manufacturing wage. In the new gig divorce model, these are the first things to be cut. When Marcus and Elena are arguing over a $300 discrepancy in the monthly support amount, a discrepancy caused by a change in an app's delivery fee structure, the real victim is the child's access to the future. The data indicates that children in high-volatility support households are significantly less likely to enroll in post-secondary education, as the families are forced to prioritize immediate survival over long-term investment. Furthermore, we are witnessing the rise of the shadow support economy. Because the legal system is so slow to adapt, many couples in 2026 are turning to informal, off-the-books arrangements. Marcus might pay Elena in cash when he has a good week, or he might buy groceries and gas directly instead of sending money through the state's processing center. While this solves the immediate cash flow problem, it creates a massive legal risk. If Elena and Marcus have a disagreement later, the state does not recognize these informal payments. Marcus could find himself legally liable for thousands of dollars in back support that he has actually already paid in the form of direct goods. This lack of legal protection for flexible payment models is a ticking time bomb for thousands of families in the Midwest. The gig economy hasn't just changed how we work, it has changed how we break up. It has introduced a level of financial chaos into the divorce process that the current legal infrastructure is simply not equipped to handle. As the Rust Belt continues to lead the nation in gig work adoption, the disconnect between 2026 labor reality and 1990 family law will only grow wider. We are essentially watching a slow-motion collision between the digital future and the bureaucratic past. But there is another factor that is complicating these metrics even further, and it has to do with the very tools we are using to solve the problem. As the human elements of the court system, the clerks, the mediators, and even the judges become overwhelmed, the Rust Belt is increasingly turning to automated solutions. In the next part of this deep dive, we are going to look at the rise of the custody algorithm. We will explore how AI is being used in 2026 to determine parenting schedules and child support amounts, and why many fear that we are stripping the empathy out of the American family unit. What happens when a machine decides how often you see your children based on your GPS data and your bank statements? The era of the digital parent is here, and the data is more invasive than you think. In the family court systems of Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, the year 2026 has marked the transition from human-centric adjudication to what legal scholars are calling the algorithmic era of domestic relations. To understand why this shift occurred, we have to look at the staggering backlog of cases that reached a breaking point in late 2025. In many Rust Belt counties, the ratio of judges to pending divorce and custody filings had become mathematically impossible to resolve through traditional hearings. The solution implemented by several state legislatures was the integration of the Parenting Plan Optimization Engine, or PPOE. This is not a simple suggestion tool. It is a sophisticated data integration platform that processes thousands of data points to generate what the state calls an optimality decree. Imagine Marcus again in Toledo. Under the old system, Marcus would stand before a judge and explain that while his work hours as a gig driver are unpredictable, he is always available for his daughter on Tuesday nights and every other weekend. The judge would use their discretion, experience, and perhaps a bit of personal bias to decide if Marcus was telling the truth. But in 2026, the PPOE doesn't care about Marcus's testimony. It cares about his digital breadcrumbs. The algorithm is granted access to Marcus's location history through his work apps, his bank transaction records, and the school's digital attendance portal. The step-by-step process of an algorithmic custody determination begins with the data ingestion phase. The system pulls the last 24 months of location data from both Marcus and Elena. It identifies the frequency of late pickups, the consistency of their residences, and even the proximity of their homes to essential services like pediatricians and extracurricular facilities. For Marcus, the algorithm identifies a pattern. His work as a delivery driver frequently takes him 30 miles away from the school during the critical 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. window. Even if Marcus says he can make it work, the PPOE calculates a high probability of deviation. This isn't a human saying Marcus is a bad father. It is a machine calculating that his economic reality creates a logistical risk to the child's stability. Historically, the legal standard for custody has been the best interests of the child. In 2026, the Rust Belt has effectively redefined this as the data-validated stability of the child. The algorithm uses a specific formula to generate a parental fitness score, or PFS. We can conceptualize this formula as PFS equals C plus FR. In this model, S represents residential stability, C represents proximity to community resources, F represents financial consistency, R represents the historical record of attendance, and V represents the volatility of the parent's schedule. For someone like Elena, who has a stable medical assistant job with fixed hours, her V value is low, and her F and S values are high. For Marcus, the gig worker, his V value is extremely high because the algorithm sees his income and location fluctuating daily. Potential outcomes of this math-driven adjudication often result in a significant skewing of parenting time toward the parent with the more traditional, stable employment profile. In the post-industrial Midwest, where traditional employment is increasingly rare, this creates a new kind of systemic bias against the gig economy worker. The deep dive into this technology reveals an even more invasive layer: sentiment analysis in co-parenting communication. In 2026, most court-ordered parenting plans in the Rust Belt require the use of centralized communication apps. These apps are now integrated with AI that monitors the tone and frequency of messages between ex-spouses. If Marcus sends a message to Elena that the algorithm flags as high conflict or aggressive, it doesn't just sit in a log for a future hearing. It actively adjusts the PFS in real time. This is the surveillance state of divorce. Historical trends suggested that high-conflict couples would eventually learn to co-parent through mediation. In 2026, the state has decided that it is more efficient to simply automate the monitoring of their behavior. Consider the case study of a specialized manufacturing town like Erie, Pennsylvania. When the local locomotive plant shifted to a more automated 3-shift schedule, the algorithm immediately flagged hundreds of custody arrangements as being out of compliance. The PPOE identified that parents on the new 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift were statistically more likely to rely on third-party childcare, which the algorithm weighs less favorably than direct parental care. This led to a wave of automated motions to modify custody, filed not by the parents, but by the system itself to maintain its definition of optimality. This is the first time in American history where the machine is the primary petitioner in family court. Furthermore, we must analyze the digital divide as a metric of marital dissolution. In the rural outskirts of the Rust Belt, where high-speed internet is still inconsistent in 2026, families are at a distinct disadvantage. If Marcus cannot reliably sync his data or if his GPS signal drops in a rural dead zone, the PPOE might interpret this lack of data as a lack of compliance. For the affluent in the revitalized urban centers, high-quality hardware and constant connectivity ensure their data presents a polished, stable image to the algorithm. For the working poor in the decaying periphery, their digital footprint is often fragmented and messy. This creates a hidden class of parents who are losing parenting time simply because their technology is as unstable as their jobs. The automation of heartbreak extends to the financial side as well. In 2026, the Rust Belt states have begun testing automated asset liquidators. This software identifies shared assets, like a 401k or a home with equity, and calculates the most tax-efficient way to split them without the need for a forensic accountant. While this saves thousands in professional fees, it often ignores the human nuances of an asset. It might suggest selling a family home that has been in one spouse's family for 3 generations simply because the spreadsheet says it is the fastest way to clear the debt. This is the trade-off of the shadow market. You get speed and efficiency, but you lose the story of the family. Step by step, we are seeing the removal of the human element from the most intimate of legal contracts. The judges in these regions, once the arbiters of community standards, have largely been relegated to the role of system administrators. They review the PPOE's outputs and sign the decrees in bulk. In 2026, a divorce in the Rust Belt can be finalized in a matter of weeks if both parties agree to follow the algorithm's optimality decree. But for those who fight the machine, the costs are higher than ever, as they must hire experts to challenge the very math that the state now considers infallible. But there is an even darker metric emerging from this digital landscape. As the algorithm pushes more and more parents out of the traditional custody model due to their economic volatility, we are seeing the rise of the divorce desert. These are entire zip codes where the legal and financial barriers to dissolution have become so high, and the automated outcomes so predictable, that people have simply stopped filing for divorce altogether. They are entering into a state of permanent, extralegal separation that exists entirely outside the eyes of the state. What happens to the social fabric of a community when the law becomes so automated and so expensive that it becomes irrelevant to the people it was meant to serve? In the next part, we will explore the rise of the common law heartland and the return of the informal marriage in a world of high-tech divorce. We will investigate why, in 2026, the most radical act in the Rust Belt is not getting a divorce, but choosing to live as if the state doesn't exist at all. The emergence of the divorce desert in 2026 represents a fundamental decoupling of the American heartland from the traditional legal infrastructure of the family. To understand this phenomenon, we have to analyze the filing to separation gap, a metric that has reached a historic high in the Rust Belt states. Historically, the number of people who identified as separated in census data closely mirrored the number of individuals who eventually finalized a divorce within 24 months. However, in 2026 we are seeing a massive divergence. In counties spanning from southern Illinois through the spine of Indiana and into rural Pennsylvania, the number of couples living apart is nearly 40% higher than the number of active divorce petitions. This is the era of the informal heartland, where the financial and algorithmic barriers we have discussed have become so prohibitive that thousands of families are simply opting out of the legal system entirely. Imagine a couple named Sarah and Tom living in a small industrial town on the outskirts of Fort Wayne, Indiana. They were married for 15 years and have 3 children. In 2025, they realized their marriage had reached its end. But when they looked at the potential outcomes of entering the formal 2026 court system, the math didn't add up. Tom is an independent contractor whose income fluctuates wildly, and Sarah works as a home health aide. They have $12,000 in equity in a modest ranch-style home, and a combined $4,000 in a savings account. Under the 2026 algorithmic systems we explored, a formal divorce would likely cost them $7,000 in legal fees and administrative costs, effectively vaporizing their entire liquid savings. Furthermore, Tom's irregular income would trigger a high volatility penalty in the state's child support calculator, potentially saddling him with a monthly obligation he couldn't meet during slow periods. So Sarah and Tom made a decision that is becoming a defining metric of the 2026 Rust Belt. They performed a quiet quit of their marriage. Tom moved into a small apartment above a local business, while Sarah remained in the family home. They didn't file a single piece of paper with the Allen County clerk. They sat at their kitchen table and drafted a handwritten ledger of who pays which utility bill and how they will rotate the children on weekends. To the state of Indiana, they are still a happily married unit. To the neighbors and their children, they are separate. They have entered the shadow of the law, a place where rights are negotiated not by statutes, but by the raw necessity of survival. This shift creates a step-by-step breakdown of the traditional family data model. Step 1 is the erosion of the marriage-to-divorce ratio as a reliable economic indicator. If people stop filing for divorce because they cannot afford the process, the divorce rate in the Rust Belt appears to be falling. In 2026, a superficial glance at state records might suggest a resurgence of marital stability in the Midwest. But when you overlay this with household composition data, you see the truth. Stability has been replaced by stasis. Step 2 is the loss of legal protection. Because Sarah and Tom are still legally married, they are still legally liable for each other's debts. If Tom misses a payment on his truck or Sarah incurs a medical bill from the clinic, the creditor can pursue both of them regardless of their private agreement. In the Rust Belt, where medical debt is a leading cause of bankruptcy, this is a financial ticking time bomb. Step 3 is the tax and benefit trap of 2026. For Sarah and Tom, being legally married while living separately creates a labyrinth of complications during tax season. If they file jointly to capture the tax credits that keep their household afloat, they are technically misrepresenting their domestic situation if they claim certain head of household exemptions. If they file separately, they often lose the very credits they need to afford their separate residences. Furthermore, in the realm of employer-sponsored healthcare, a dwindling but vital resource in the Rust Belt, Sarah's insurance might cover Tom. If they were to divorce, Tom would be forced onto the individual exchange, an expense he cannot afford. This creates a state of medical dependency that keeps people legally tethered long after the emotional bond has vanished. The data indicates that this trend is creating a new sociological category: the de facto single parent. These are individuals who are performing the labor of a single parent without the legal standing to enforce support or custody. In 2026, we see a rise in what is called community-verified custody. In the absence of a court order, schools and doctors in these regions are increasingly relying on notarized letters or church-led mediation to determine who can sign for a child's surgery or pick them up from practice. This is a return to a pre-industrial communal form of family regulation. Historical trends suggest that when the central state's legal mechanisms become too costly or complex, local social institutions, churches, unions, and extended families step in to fill the void. But the most dangerous metric of the informal heartland is the retirement cliff. In 2026, a significant portion of a Rust Belt couple's future security is tied to the division of 401ks and Social Security spousal benefits. By bypassing the legal system, Sarah and Tom are forfeiting the qualified domestic relations orders that would legally split Tom's modest pension or Sarah's retirement account. They are essentially gambling that 30 years from now, they will still be on good enough terms to share those resources voluntarily. The potential outcomes of this gamble are bleak. Data from older populations who practiced informal separation in the 1990s shows a 50% higher poverty rate in old age compared to those who finalized a legal dissolution. Furthermore, we must analyze the impact on the real estate market. The 2026 housing inventory in states like Michigan is being squeezed by what are known as debt title homes. These are properties owned by legally married but separated couples who cannot sell because they cannot agree on the split and cannot afford the legal fees to force a partition sale. This contributes to the overall stagnation of the region, as young families are locked out of the market by homes that are essentially trapped in a marital purgatory. Imagine the psychological toll of this lack of finality. In the 2026 Rust Belt, thousands of people are living in a state of permanent transition. They cannot truly move on to new relationships because the specter of their legal marriage hangs over every financial and social interaction. We see this reflected in the rise of what is called the shadow dating market, where individuals must navigate the complexities of being separated but not divorced, a status that carries significant social and legal baggage in 2026. This creates a culture of ambiguity that erodes the very concept of the social contract. This is the autopsy of the industrial marriage reaching its final stage. The system was built for a world of clear lines, stable jobs, and accessible courts. In the fragmented reality of 2026, those lines have blurred into a gray market of domesticity. The Rust Belt is no longer just a laboratory for divorce metrics. It is the front line of a movement where the family is being redefined by what people can afford to do, rather than what the law says they should do. But as these informal separations become the norm, a new and unexpected crisis is emerging from the digital lives these couples leave behind. While they might be able to ignore the state, they cannot ignore the algorithm. As the first generation of truly digital native couples in the Rust Belt begins to fragment, they are finding that their lives are entangled in ways that a handwritten ledger cannot solve. In the next part of this deep dive, we are going to look at the digital estate fracture. We will investigate what happens to shared streaming accounts, crypto wallets, and the digital identity of a family when the physical household dissolves. Who owns the family's digital legacy in 2026? The answer is buried in terms of service agreements that no one ever read, and it is creating a new kind of poverty that isn't measured in dollars but in access. The digital estate fracture is the latest and perhaps most insidious metric of marital dissolution in the American heartland as we navigate the complexities of 2026. To understand the gravity of this shift, we must move beyond the physical assets like the split-level ranch or the Ford F-150 and look at the invisible architecture of a modern life. In 2026, the average American household manages over 25 different subscription services, from AI-driven educational tutors for their children to shared cloud storage and decentralized finance wallets. When a marriage in a city like Akron, Ohio, or South Bend, Indiana, fractures, the legal system is often ill-equipped to handle the delinking of these digital identities. This creates a state of digital poverty where one spouse is suddenly disconnected from the tools required to function in a modern economy. Imagine a woman named Kimberly living in a revitalized neighborhood in Akron. In 2026, Kimberly is 42 years old and has spent the last decade building a life that is entirely digitized. Her home features a smart security system, her children's academic progress is tracked through a proprietary school portal, and the family's modest savings are partially held in a shared cryptocurrency wallet that served as a hedge against regional banking fluctuations. Her husband, who worked in IT for a regional logistics firm, was the primary account holder, the digital architect of their domestic life. When the decision to separate was made, the fracture wasn't just emotional, It was a total system shutdown. Step 1 of the digital estate fracture is the admin power dynamic. In the current 2026 landscape, most digital service providers, from Google to Amazon to specialized crypto exchanges, recognize only one primary identity. While these companies offer family plans, the ultimate control over the data, the history, and the access rights remains with the individual who initially created the account. When Kimberly's husband moved out, he didn't just take his clothes. He changed the password to the primary email account that served as the recovery address for every other service they used. Historically, a spouse might hide a physical bank statement. In 2026, they can effectively vanish the entire digital footprint of the other spouse with a single biometric update. This leads to the phenomenon of the cloud custody battle. For Kimberly, the loss of access to the shared cloud storage meant the loss of 10 years of family documentation. We are talking about everything from digital birth certificates and tax records to the high-resolution videos of her children's first steps. In 2026, these are not just sentimental items. They are essential data points for navigating the bureaucracy of a divorce. Without access to these records, Kimberly found herself in a step-by-step struggle to prove her financial history to the court. The historical trends show that in the Rust Belt, where many families are already operating on thin margins, the cost of recreating this digital identity, re-verifying accounts, paying for new individual subscriptions, and hiring digital forensic experts to recover locked data, can exceed $5,000 in the first 6 months alone. Furthermore, we must examine the intersection of the Internet of Things and domestic stability. In 2026, smart home technology is no longer a luxury. It is standard in many middle-class Midwestern homes. This has introduced a new metric known as digital coercion. Potential outcomes of a digital estate fracture often include the use of smart thermostats, doorbells, and lighting systems as tools of psychological warfare. In Kimberly's case, her ex-husband still had administrative access to the home's smart hub. From a separate apartment 3 miles away, he could monitor when she arrived home through the doorbell camera or adjust the temperature in the house. This is the 2026 reality of the heartland. The home is no longer a fortress. It is a network device that can be manipulated from a distance. The legal metrics in Ohio have seen a 30% spike in domestic protection orders, specifically citing digital harassment through shared smart home platforms. The financial implications extend deep into the world of decentralized finance, or DeFi. In 2026, many families in the Rust Belt have turned to crypto assets as a way to build wealth outside of traditional industrial cycles. However, the very nature of blockchain, designed for privacy and security, makes it a nightmare for the division of marital property. If Kimberly's husband holds the private keys to a wallet containing $20,000 in assets, the court can order him to split it, but it has no technical mechanism to enforce that order if he claims the keys were lost or the wallet was hacked. This has led to the rise of the digital discovery specialist in the Midwest. These are professionals who spend hundreds of hours tracing transactions through the ledger to ensure that marital assets aren't being hidden in the ether. We also have to talk about the digital legacy of children. In 2026, children in the Rust Belt are growing up with a digital portfolio that begins at birth. Their grades, their athletic statistics, and their creative projects are stored in school-sanctioned AI repositories. When a divorce occurs, the question of who has the right to manage this data becomes a central conflict. Does the custodial parent have the right to delete a child's digital footprint? Does the non-custodial parent have the right to use that data to track the child's location? The data indicates that children in high-conflict digital divorces are 25% more likely to experience academic setbacks due to the loss of access to their primary learning platforms during the separation period. A deep dive into these metrics reveals a growing gap in tech literacy among the divorced population. In regions with lower educational attainment, the spouse who is not the digital gatekeeper often finds themselves in a state of total isolation. They may not know how to secure their own biometric data, or how to set up a two-factor authentication that is independent of their former partner. This is a new form of vulnerability that is specific to our current year. It is a metric of survival. In 2026, if you are locked out of your digital life, you are effectively locked out of your economic life. Imagine the stress of trying to apply for a job or a new apartment when your digital reputation is still tied to a joint account that is currently in collections. In the Rust Belt, where credit scores are already under pressure from the economic shifts we have discussed, the digital estate fracture can be the final blow to a person's financial standing. A joint credit card that was tied to a shared Amazon Prime account or a shared mobile phone plan can lead to a cascade of missed payments that neither party takes responsibility for, but both are punished for by the algorithms. This is the hidden cost of the Heartland's digital transition. We have moved the entire structure of the family online, but we have not updated the legal or social guardrails to protect that structure when it breaks. Kimberly's story is the story of thousands of women and men across the Midwest who are finding that their hardest battle isn't in the courtroom, but in the settings menu of their own lives. They are fighting for the right to own their own history and to protect their own future from a partner who still holds the admin rights to their existence. But as we look at the wreckage of the digital household, we have to realize that this is merely the setup for the final, most encompassing metric of all. The data we have analyzed, from the housing trap to the kinship care spike to the rise of the custody algorithm, is leading to a singular conclusion. We are not just witnessing the end of a specific type of marriage. We are witnessing the birth of a new American demographic. In our final part, we are going to synthesize all these metrics to look at the future of the heart. We will investigate the 2026 trend of permanent cohabitation and the rise of the intentional community in the Rust Belt. Are we moving toward a world where the traditional nuclear family is replaced by a network of economically linked survivors? The map of the American heartland is being redrawn, and the final lines are more surprising than the data suggests. What is the true cost of a broken dream? And can a new one be built in the ruins of the old? The answer is in the final metric of resilience. The resilience metric in 2026 is not measured by the absence of struggle, but by the innovation born from necessity. As we conclude this deep dive into the American heartland, we find that the final stage of the industrial marriage autopsy is the birth of something entirely new. Resilience in cities like Youngstown, Ohio, and Erie, Pennsylvania, has taken the form of a social restructuring that bypasses the traditional nuclear model entirely. This is the era of the intentional kinship cluster. To understand this, we must look at the data surrounding the 2026 co-living boom. Historical trends showed that after the housing crisis of the early 2000s, multi-generational living increased. But in the current year, we are seeing a shift where unrelated, divorced individuals are forming single economic units to combat the very metrics of decay we have analyzed in this series. Imagine Marcus and Elena once more. In our previous chapters, we saw Marcus struggling with the gig economy gap and the algorithmic custody traps of Toledo. We saw Elena navigating the housing trap and the digital estate fracture. In a traditional 1990s narrative, their story might end in a clean break or a bitter, lifelong legal battle. But in 2026, the potential outcomes are being rewritten by a new form of pragmatic cooperation. Marcus and Elena, realizing that the cost of two separate lives in the current economy is a fast track to bankruptcy, have entered into what sociologists call a post-marital partnership agreement. Step one of this process involves the decoupling of romance from residency. In 2026, we see a 22% increase in divorced couples in the Midwest who choose to remain co-investors in their primary asset, the home, while legally dissolving their marriage. Marcus moves into a converted suite in the basement, providing him with a stable home base that satisfies the residency requirements of the parenting plan optimization engine. Elena remains in the upper levels. They draft a step-by-step legal contract that outlines the division of utility costs, the specific hours of kitchen access, and a clause for what happens if one party enters a new long-term relationship. This is the resilience of the heartland. The ability to prioritize the children's stability and the preservation of equity over the desire for total physical separation. Beyond the individual household, we are witnessing the rise of the intentional community metric. In Gary, Indiana, and Flint, Michigan, the data for 2026 shows a spike in the purchase of multi-unit properties by groups of 3 or 4 single-parent families. These are often women like Kimberly from Akron, who have navigated the digital estate fracture and realize that the only way to thrive is through shared resources. Step 1 for these groups is the formation of a limited liability company, or LLC, to hold the property. Step 2 is the creation of a shared childcare rotation, which historical trends show reduces the monthly expense of third-party care by up to 60%. Step 3 is the integration of their digital lives, sharing the costs of high-speed internet, AI educational tutors, and bulk delivery services. This shift is creating a new demographic known as the neo-traditionalists. These are younger residents of the Rust Belt, aged 22 to 30, who have grown up watching the industrial marriage dissolve in real time. The data for 2026 indicates that this cohort is entering into legal unions at the lowest rate in American history, Yet they are forming stable, long-term households at a rate that is actually climbing. They are prioritizing the contract over the ceremony. They are utilizing the very legal technologies and mediation tools we discussed in earlier parts to build preemptive structures. They aren't waiting for a divorce to decide how assets are split. They are using 2026 software to simulate potential outcomes before they even buy a car together. The final synthesis of our metrics reveals a startling truth. The Rust Belt is not dying. It is becoming the blueprint for a post-individualist America. The high divorce rates we saw in the early parts of this series were the clearing of a forest that was no longer adapted to the climate. What is growing in its place is a hardier, more flexible social unit. When we look at the debt-to-income ratios of these new intentional communities, they are often 15% lower than the regional average for traditional nuclear families. When we look at the educational outcomes for the children in these clusters, the stability provided by multiple invested adults, the kinship care model expanded to friends and peers, is actually narrowing the achievement gap that we previously attributed to divorce. However, we must also address the risks inherent in this new model. Historical trends in communal living suggest that without a clear legal framework, these arrangements can lead to complex litigation when one party wants to exit. In 2026, the Rust Belt states are currently debating the Uniform Non-Nuclear Property Act, a piece of legislation designed to provide a step-by-step process for the dissolution of these non-marital economic units. The potential outcomes of this legislation will define the next decade of the Heartland. If the state can provide the same legal protections to a three-parent co-living cluster that it once provided to the industrial couple of the 1950s, the Rust Belt may achieve a level of social stability that has eluded it for 40 years. The deep dive into these metrics shows that the American heartland is undergoing a massive, data-driven recalibration. We have seen how the loss of the factory led to the loss of the marriage, but we are now seeing how the loss of the marriage is leading to the rediscovery of the community. The autopsy is over. The results are in. The industrial marriage was a creature of a specific economic era, and it could not survive the transition to the digital, gig-driven reality of 2026. But the human need for stability, for shared resources, and for the protection of the next generation has found a new way to express itself. Marcus and Elena are not failures. They are pioneers of a new domesticity. The grandparents in our kinship care case studies are not just victims of a broken system. They are the anchors of a new social safety net. The shadow market mediators and the pro-SE litigants are not just signs of a failing legal system. They are the creators of a more accessible, albeit messy, form of justice. This is the story of the Rust Belt in the current year, a region that has been broken down to its base elements and is now being forged into something that can withstand the volatility of the 21st century. As we look at the map of the Heartland today, we don't see a wasteland of broken homes. We see a laboratory of resilience. We see people who have looked at the metrics of their own lives and decided that if the old dream is dead, they will simply build a better one. They are using the algorithms, the debt, and the stagnation as the raw materials for a new kind of American stability. The metrics of divorce were just the beginning. They were the warning signs that the old way was no longer working. The real story is what happens next. But while the Rust Belt has found its own way to adapt, a new and much more global shadow is beginning to fall across the demographic landscape. While we have focused on the heartland of America, the same forces of algorithmic displacement and economic volatility are beginning to hit the megacities of the world. What happens when the metrics we have analyzed in a town like Flint, Michigan, are applied to the 30 million people in a place like Tokyo or the high-tech hubs of Bangalore? Is the collapse of the industrial marriage a local phenomenon? Or is it the first domino in a global dissolution of the human contract? In our next investigative series, we leave the Rust Belt behind to look at the global loneliness metric and the rise of the artificial companion as the primary domestic unit of 2027. The data is already moving, and the next fracture is closer than you think.